to, please feel free to put your names in the chat and introduce yourselves. We also will be recording the session, so if you don't want your names to be tagged or to your faces, I see many people have put their videos off, so that's good. But if you want your faces to be shown, please put your video on. We would love to see your faces. That would be nice, but please remain muted when you have a speaker speaking. But when you want to ask a question, we'll have a 10 to 15 minutes question and answer time later on. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Once again, welcome and welcome. I will start by introducing myself. I am Christy Ikorin. I am Nigerian, born in Nigeria. I am a project engineer by profession with a chemical engineering background, but I'm also Dutch. I'm currently living in the Netherlands. I work with Women Engaged for a Common Future, and I'm the director for the Dutch office. Now, Women Engaged for a Common Future has been in existence for over 25 years, and we are a non-profit organization which is focused on having a dedicated, gender-just and healthy planet for everyone. We work with organizations across the globe who are focused on giving women and girls a chance to be involved in sustainable development, as well as having a climate just world. In Africa, we have more than 20 partners, and so we're really proud today to be able to engage with WEP, who have pushed and persevered in developing a national action plan on gender and climate change. This made Nigeria to be the first African country to adopt a gender action plan under the framework of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. So, and I don't know, I guess most of you are aware that the COP, the Convention of Parties, the 27th version of it will be held in Egypt and will be kicked off next week already. And so it's really a great opportunity that we have Tara Daniels, who will be speaking in a short while, making the connection of the United Nations frameworks on Convention on Climate Change and this Gender Action Plan, and asking that question, vulnerable voices considered in the climate action. So in a little while, you will hear more from Tara, but I'll tell you a little bit more about Tara Daniels. She's a senior program manager of Women, Environment and Development Organization, WEDO. Tara leads the WEDO's a portfolio of work on feminist climate finance and supporting women participation and leadership in climate negotiations. She advocates for gender responsive climate policies, particularly working with women, particularly working with the women and gender constituency. Tara draws from her interdisciplinary background, given that she has a dual master degrees in sustainable development and conservation biology, as well as public policy from the University of Maryland. So like I said, in a short while, we'll be hearing more from Tara, but I would love to give the floor to Dr. Priscilla Ochakpa, who is the founder and the global lead of WEP. So, Dr. Priscilla, I hope you're ready. I'll give you the floor. Please give us some welcome notes.
Christy. Thank you very much, Christy. Thank you very much, Tara. For me, it's a pleasure to have all of you here. Just before we started, I was discussing with Christy and Tara that I don't know what is there, but we had over 150 people that are registered for this event. And I'm hoping that all of them will join this event. It is one of its kind. And as you know, Christy has already stated so many things. We're a partner to also WEDO and a partner to WECF. These are our long-standing partners, and we've been working together. It's been so amazing working with these two organizations at the global level, addressing the issues of gender inequalities, especially in climate change, but also in environment. So it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here and to say that this development series is actually targeted on the issues of the Gender Action Plan. And most of you have known that this is a very critical issue that as of today, most of the countries have not even developed their own action plan. But it's also one of the deliverables at the UNFCCC, even though it's said that it's not binding. But for us, we see it as a critical component of advancing gender inequality. So for us at WEP and most of our partners that we will work with, we are always striving to see how we can bring the issues of gender, especially in environment, by looking at it from the perspective of climate-induced conflict, which most of the times is being neglected, the issues of mobility, which is also sometimes being neglected when it comes to climate, to discuss some of those issues. So I want to use this opportunity to welcome you and to say a very big thank you for being part of this development series, Christy and Tara. I know that all of you are very vast in these issues, and I strongly believe that our guests who have signed up to this won't be disappointed. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priscilla, for that very wonderful welcome. And yeah, I know a bit, to be honest, about COP and climate and gender action plans, because that's something I'm learning with my wonderful organization. Well, we have Tara Daniels, who has a vast knowledge about the United Nations frameworks on gender and on climate change. So I would love to give her the floor, Tara Daniels, if you're ready, who will be taking us through a little bit of the framework and also letting us know indeed how vulnerable voices and what are the vulnerable voices when we talk about that, how they're involved in the climate change discussion that's going on the United Nations. So Tara Daniels, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. I'm really glad to be here with you all today. I'm going to be sharing my screen as we're going to use some slides to help navigate the UNFCCC GAP, and that is because it can be pretty complex, and we want to make sure that we are able to really engage and hopefully have some time for questions at the end as well. So let's dive into this UNFCCC Gender Action Plan and consider this question of how it provides space or doesn't provide space for vulnerable voices. So we do have a history of following the UNFCCC because we emerged around the time that the UNFCCC was itself created. So we have been following gender in the UNFCCC since its beginning. And so that's going to enable me to give you kind of a four-part presentation today. First, we're going to look at the history of gender under the UNFCCC. Then we're going to look at the Gender Action Plan, consider what it is and what it isn't as well. Consider this moment that we are in right now with the Gender Action Plan coming into its midterm review at COP27, and then what tools and resources that we know of that can help you navigate both the gap, the history of gender under the UNFCCC, and advocacy around these areas. So first, let's dive into the history of why it is that we need a gap and how the gap came about. So here's a snapshot from a publication that's called the Pocket Guide to Gender Equality under the UNFCCC. You can see it starts in 2001. So that was the first year that there was any mention of women or gender and any sort of decision that referenced that within the UNFCCC, because it wasn't built into the UNFCCC when it was adopted back in 1992 and came into force in 1994. So we have this long history leading to the adoption of the 5-year Enhanced Lima Work Program and its gap at the other end at 2019. And one thing that's important to note is that thinking about gender in the UNFCCC, there are decisions around gender and an incorporation of gender that exists outside of the Gender Action Plan. This is not the only place where gender lives and will continue to exist outside of the Gender Action Plan, even though that's not our focus today. But some of these moments that have happened over time that we'll dive into start to explore that. So what was this first moment back in 2001? It was a standalone decision that was related really solely to the participation and representation of women. And we've seen this emphasis on striving towards gender balance in the decision-making procedures of the UNFCCC for a very long time. It's only later that we started to get a more robust understanding of what it meant to talk about gender and climate interlinkages beyond women's participation and representation in the process. And even though there have been these calls for gender balance for over 20 years now, it is important to note that we are not at all close to gender balance in terms of the negotiators that are showing up in these decision-making spaces. So next, we had a decision that was 11 years later, and that was the next time that there was a standalone decision on gender. But what it did is it made gender and climate change a standing item on the agenda, which meant that it would be discussed every COP. And it sets the goal of gender balance as a gradual but significant increase. So we're still coming back to this idea of gender balance being a key aspect of any discussion on gender. And we moved from that moment in 2012 to this moment in 2014. And this is a really key inflection point, because this is the emergence of the Lima Work Program on Gender. And it said, let's review all of the places where gender has been referenced, where there are gender-related mandates in the UNFCCC. Because I was just talking about the standalone decisions that were dealing with gender, but gender already existed in the UNFCCC in terms of discussions on adaptation and capacity building. There were a lot of other things that the Lima Work Program on Gender did, but I do want to note this last bullet point in particular, because it led to the development of staff capacity within the UNFCCC Secretariat. And there's now a gender team, not just a senior focal point for gender, that helps to administer and govern the mandates that are arising for gender and climate change. So this Lima Work Program on Gender really prefaced what we were later to get with the Gender Action Plan. And so 2 years later, when the Lima Work Program on Gender was extended, there was this mandate to develop the possible elements of an actual gender action plan. So we have the Lima Work Program pulling together these different streams of work and trying to build coherence and understanding different gender activities. Now in 2016, we have the potential elements of the Gender Action Plan. It's also important to note, and again, these are just a few of the activities under this decision. It's not exhaustive, but that this was when parties were first invited to appoint a national gender focal point that we now refer to as National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points, and there are only over 90 of those, over 90 parties that have appointed National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points. So that gets us to the Gender Action Plan. So from 2016, this idea of developing elements for the Gender Action Plan, the very next COP, there was a Gender Action Plan that was adopted after a series of meetings and discussions throughout 2017. Sorry, it refers to previous slides, but I was trying to streamline this presentation. The decision was organized into 5 clusters, and we will look at those clusters because they still exist in today's Gender Action Plan. This, though, was the first Gender Action Plan. It was a 2-year Gender Action Plan. And in addition to having these actions that would advance the state of gender responsive climate policy, takes into account human rights, just transition. It has a lot of the recognition and realization of what it means to truly understand the interlinkages between gender and climate change in a way that we necessarily hadn't seen before or as robustly. But how this ultimately translates into action, how this ultimately provides space for incorporating vulnerable voices, for example, that's more difficult. This is something that in many ways exists as reifications of these ideas on paper, but there's a limited set of activities associated with the Gender Action Plan. We will be looking at the Gender Action Plan activities under the new Gender Action Plan. But I did want to just quickly note what this new Gender Action Plan does. it was this moment where after the extension of the Lima Work Program on Gender and after this 2-year Gender Action Plan had been implemented, where in 2019, there was finally alignment to combine and to have an enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender and its Gender Action Plan. So looking ahead for a 5-year Gender Action Plan that built on the activities in these 5 priority areas from the first Gender Action Plan, with a really strong emphasis on capacity building, a real recognition of the importance of gender responsive technology, and then coming back to this idea of these national gender and climate change focal points, thinking about their role and what capacity was needed for that particular role. So this is a brief that the Women in Gender constituency have put together about the gap. I'm going to link to it here because I think it's a really great starting place to understand the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan. So as I open this up, we can see it's an 8-page brief, I believe, and you can scroll through it, and I'll provide you with this presentation so that you can link to it yourself. But one of the first things that it does is it suggests that you read the Gender Action Plan. That's one of the best ways to understand it. And you can see here, it says that there are 5 priority areas in the gap. These are the 5 clusters that were first decided in 2017 that were carried forward into this new gap as well. And when we just briefly open up this gap, we're going to see these 5 clusters. So the gap consists of a series of activities. This is the gap. It is a table that is an annex to the Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender. And you can see these activities. You're looking at activity A1 and A2 and A3 and A4, and they're all under priority area A, this first of the 5 priority areas around which the gap is. All are 20 activities. And these 20 activities have different responsible parties or responsible actors. Some may be leading. So here on strengthening capacity building efforts under A1, we see that parties are leading. I realize this might be a little small, so let me see if I can zoom in a bit and see if that helps. So we have responsible actors for each of the different activities. We have the timeline of when certain deliverables or outputs are happening. Sometimes it's very specific outputs. It's specifically an in-session workshop. And this particular in-session workshop for A2, discussing and clarifying the role of the National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points, took place at COP27. So this is a real fundamental understanding of the gap, that it has 20 activities, that those activities may be undertaken or led by different sets of actors with different levels of responsibility, and that there's different kinds of outputs and deliverables associated. Sometimes it is an ongoing activity, such as the implementation of capacity building, or it's a single activity, such as an in-session workshop, or a call for submissions. And these submissions are going to be important, and we will revisit them later. I'm just going to quickly scroll through the rest of the gap so that you can see there's 5 activities under priority area A on capacity building, 3 activities under priority area B that comes back to this idea of gender balance that has always been thought about when gender has been discussed under the UNFCCC. Priority area C on coherence specifically thinks about the constituted bodies under the UNFCCC, and there's 3 activities there. Priority area D on implementation is by far the biggest priority area, has 7 different activities. And we'll be discussing one of them a little bit later, D1, in fact, on gender budgeting. And then there's a last priority area on monitoring and reporting, and that's really led by the Secretariat. And so that's how we have a glimpse into how implementation is going right now from these monitoring and reporting activities, as well as the fact that we're having this midterm review of the gap coming up at COP27 or continued at COP27. So I am back on the screen here, and I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to get out of this background paper, and we're going to go into a series of questions and answers on the gap. and these capture some common misconceptions on the gap. So first, there's this question of, is the Gender Action Plan the main work stream for implementing gender responsive climate policy under the UNFCCC? And as I introduced, no, this is not the only place where gender lives. This is not the primary place even where gender lives. There are mandates on gender across all of the work streams of the UNFCCC at this point: technology, finance, adaptation, mitigation. But it's important that we seek coherence, and there's also a real opportunity to engage with the constituted bodies in the gap and to ensure that their work under these different work streams is done in a gender responsive manner. The next question is on this question of women's participation and gender balance. Does the gap actually set a 50% goal? And it does not. So we still have this goal that exists back from 2012 on a gradual but significant increase in the participation of women. Now, in 2019, when we were advocating as the Women and Gender constituency for what we wanted to see in this new gap, we absolutely wanted to see some progress measures and to have targets set. And we said, let's see 3 to 5% a year improvement, because right now we're not seeing that. And as you recall, when we opened up that gap, one of the headings you did not see was anything that said progress indicators or targets, because that was not incorporated into this gap, which is another piece that does make it difficult when we're thinking about implementation and how effective implementation has or hasn't been at this point. This next question is about these national gender action plans. And so we had this amazing introduction recognizing particularly the leadership that Nigeria has shown in developing its own gender action plan and a strategy that clearly shows the linkages between gender and climate. Now, this is not a requirement of the GAP. It is something that several countries have undertaken, but it's not necessarily part of the GAP. It's something I think that can absolutely contribute to a national level implementation of the GAP on all of those activities where parties are leading and are responsible. We do know that Sudan has also used it back when the original GAP, the first 2-year GAP, was adopted, and they used that to help structure some of their thinking. And then even prior to that, IUCN has been working on CC GAPs, climate change and gender action plans, and have a methodology for that. And right now, there's also various NDC planning processes that are happening that are gender responsive, but we know UNDP has been working with some of those. So I think this is a continued area to explore and to consider the different types of gender action plans that have emerged and how they can complement the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan that has obligations both at an international level as well as a national level. Does the Gender Action Plan define a number of mandates that parties must follow when implementing national climate policy? In other words, does it have a set of check boxes to say, oh, we're doing this, we're on track? And it doesn't. It's not even necessarily giving direct mandates to parties on how to implement national climate policy. As we remember, the UNFCCC, it's a very party-driven process. And so this gets back to the heart of what the GAP is, and it's this series of activities that different actors can choose to undertake and can contribute to in different ways. And the actor that has the most mandate, of course, is the Secretariat in implementing those activities that it's been asked to lead on. Is there a terms of reference for the National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points? So this comes up a lot. What is this role? We have this A2 activity on discussing and clarifying the role of the National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points. There have been virtual workshops on this. There's been a physical workshop at COP26. But ultimately, there is a recognition right now that there are different directions that this work can take. Parties have been invited to appoint and provide support for national gender and climate change focal points, but there is not a set terms of reference, a set of specific duties and responsibilities that are the same across all parties. And we've seen parties take on this role in different ways and support it in different ways. And the question of support is also one that has come up a lot when we're thinking about the current conversations of this midterm review. So as we get into this midterm review, let's look at implementation. Of course, implementation started right at the beginning of the pandemic. So that's a very important context to have. But let's talk about the gap here at COP27. First, there are some mandated events at COP that are related to gender. And the last two of these, I think, are really important because they speak directly to GAP activities. So activity B3 of the GAP invited, the facilitative working group of the LKIP, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, to have a joint dialogue. That's happening. There's also going to be a dialogue on gender budgeting that aligns with the gender budgeting activity that's D1 under the GAP. So we're actually seeing implementation of the GAP at an international level at this upcoming conference. Where are we in the negotiations as we look at this midterm review? So there were draft conclusions in June. That was when the intersessionals were held in Bonn, but these draft conclusions were pretty procedural. They said we had a rich discussion, and there was a rich discussion, and it resulted in 2 co-facilitators' notes, 2 informal notes that are full of bracketed negotiated text. These might be inputs into the negotiations that are about to start, but they do not limit the negotiations. This is not the text that's going to show up on screen to start the negotiations, because there's 2 different versions of these texts. There's 2 different ideas. And even within that, there's lots of bracketing, lots of undecided and unagreed text. So we're really at a point where the negotiators are trying to come in and find some agreement and consensus on how do we modify the gap at this point of this midterm review and reflect upon the progress that has been made. And it's not an easy task. So as we look at the inputs to the negotiations, we do see the type of information that the negotiators have to inform this process. So a lot of these synthesis reports by the Secretariat are based on submissions. And some of these submissions were part of the GAP itself, a call for submissions on gender differentiated impacts, which is that 4th bullet, for example, as part of the GAP. So there are these various synthesis reports, as well as some annual reporting that happens on gender composition and gender balance that the Secretariat's been undertaking since that 2012 decision, so that we can see that women's participation in the negotiations is slowly and often very unevenly improving, and sometimes we don't see improvement at all from year to year. So let's look particularly at this first let's look particularly at a key synthesis report, and that is the synthesis report on the implementation of the activities in the Gender Action Plan. So this is the question of what's been happening under the GAP. I've taken direct excerpts from this report to discuss. So first we see that there were 18 submissions. And you can see these on the UNFCCC submission portal, and I might actually provide that link in this document before I share this slide out so that you can go directly and see the submissions that are relevant, for example, for the Africa group. There were also submissions by observers, including the Women and Gender constituency. What the Secretariat said is they said, we saw efforts to implement all of the activities, but some activities had more action than others, which I think could be expected. But then they also noted a little later on that most of the submissions didn't link action taken to the specific activities. So the Secretariat was making that decision, or forced to make that decision, about where these different actions fell under these different 20 GAP activities. And then ultimately, they found that assessing progress is challenging because submissions were the key inputs, and 18 is not a lot of submissions. And of course, if you're not mapping it directly to the activities, and if there is no framework for that mapping, if there isn't an indicator, there isn't a structure, then it's hard to compare this information. So I think to this overall question about vulnerable voices, we look at the GAP activities, there's not a GAP activity specific to ensuring input. And then this failure to kind of have this framework that we had called for to really understand progress means that we're obscuring progress that is being made and not necessarily fully understanding it or being able to share it out usefully under these activities. And that would be my personal opinion about how I do not think that this gap in its current implementation has really provided a platform for vulnerable voices. However, I do think that continued study of what the gap does provide and the types of activities it does support, as well as investment in this current midterm review process that can actually result in enhancements to the gap, could be really important. I'm going to get into that a bit later, but let's get back to implementation first. So this set of challenges that the Secretariat, again, using their language exactly, quoted were this lack of dedicated financial support, obviously the context of the pandemic, and then also a general lack of capacity. And I think it gets back to the fact that A1, the very first activity in the GAP, is about capacity to do this work. There are these opportunities, though, for strengthening this work. There were lots of recommendations on how to improve the activities, on how to develop indicators, adding new activities and references, and exploring ways to really have an intersectional approach. And we know that an intersectional approach would be incredibly critical to actually ensuring that there is space for vulnerable voices and perspectives to be integrated into national level as well as international implementation of this gap. So where does that leave us? I want to highlight a few tools and resources to deepen understanding of the gap, gender in the UNFCCC, as well as the advocacy that can be done as we look forward and as we want to use this, of course, as a platform for strengthening gender responsive implementation. So highlighting again this document and the links to this document about the gap and what it is and how to learn more about it. I think it's a great kind of companion piece as you're looking through the gap itself to think through what does the gap say and doesn't say. There's also this ECBI pocket guide that I mentioned earlier when I showed the timeline. And in addition to walking through the history of gender in the UNFCCC, it looks a little bit at this question of what is gender and why does gender matter within climate change context. And it's a very useful, hopefully, document to help guide you through. There's another document, or there's not another document, there's another tool that I want to highlight, and that's the Gender Climate Tracker. So whereas the ECBI really, pocket guide is really a book, you read through it as a book, the Gender Climate Tracker is a website as well as an app. And you can look for decisions through COP26 on every time gender or women have been mentioned in the negotiations. Anytime a mandate has been created for parties for the convention to follow through on, for example, striving towards gender balance, incorporating gender responsive planning and adaptation processes, etc., searching by those different thematic areas. You can look at the history of women's participation statistics, country by country, back to 2008. So you can look specifically at your country as well as the history overall. It's easier on the website than the app to see the overall numbers. You can look at country profiles, so including countries that may have included references to gender in their NDCs. There's also resources and news articles that can be tagged per individual country on the website only. That's a feature that's not available on the app yet. and you can submit resources that are relevant. And we're hoping that this can help ultimately contribute to GAP implementation. If we can have a better system for compiling and understanding when there are wonderful actions going on, when there are toolkits and guidebooks and case studies and reports and analyses that are being done, if we can compile them in one place and compile them by country as well, that there will be more information sharing to help guide the work moving forward. As we look at COP27, it's key to note that African feminist demands that are specific to what we want to see coming out of COP27. This was a process that has been happening since January of this year, and these were launched very recently. And I hope that this is not the first time you are hearing about them if you are on this call, but if so, please do read them. They cover every aspect of the negotiations, but I think they do speak to this need for complementarity, coherence, leadership, capacity building when it comes to really understanding gender and climate interlinkages. And they are available in French, English, Portuguese, Kiswahili, and Arabic. We also have priorities that the Women and Gender constituency is putting forward for what they want to see in the Gender Action Plan specifically. Now, there is a Women and Gender constituency advocacy call in a little over an hour from now. So that's also a space where I'm sure these will be brought up. But there's kind of 6 key things that they're looking for overall, as well as some specific textual suggestions to try and have negotiators bring into the room as they're trying to revise this gap. But it's imperative that we are recognizing the context of the COVID pandemic, that we're making sure that this work on just transition by the International Labor Organization is not just existing, but is actually informing and advancing this work that we need to do towards a just transition. Recognizing, obviously, that loss and damage is having disproportionate impacts on frontline communities, particularly women and girls. Recognizing the role that should be played as we consider agroecology, and this is another moment of potential coherence across the UNFCCC negotiations as there are discussions on the Carinivia Joint Work Program on agriculture. Climate finance, as always, is imperative, and ensuring that there's finance for climate implementation at the national level and regional levels, and ensuring, again, coherence to these broader global efforts to advance work. We know that we had CSW earlier this year, for example, that had strong outcomes when it comes to gender and climate change, or at least stronger in some senses relative to the UNFCCC. I think there's still a lot of work that can continue to be done. So that's where I wanted to end at this moment that we have of advocacy, but also with this reminder that the gap, regardless of the outcomes of this particular set of negotiations, will continue to exist for several more years. So even if, regardless of what additions are made to it, there's still a clear opportunity for implementation under the current set of activities. And I hope that this presentation has helped you understand a little bit more about what the gap is, what it isn't, and that ultimately there's a huge amount of responsibility that lies on individual actors choosing to. This includes parties, this includes relevant organizations, this includes national gender and climate change focal points, choosing to take up the mantle to enact these activities. And of course, we know that that choice is very much prescribed by what available capacity and finance and support that there is to take forward these activities. So I'm going to stop sharing for now and give it back to the moderator in case there are any questions. Thanks so much, Christy.
Well, thank you very much, Tara, for that wonderful in-depth and presentation and overview of GAP in connection with UNFCCC. We know that the UNFCCC framework is already one of the complex ones under the UN, and then the gap put in there. So you've done such a wonderful job. I want to really thank you for that. I haven't seen any questions yet in the chat, but please, if you have any burning questions or comments, observations, anything you would like to, please ask or share. Here is our opportunity. We started this session a little bit late, so we have at least 15 minutes for questions and answers. So please, would love to hear from you if you have any question. Just because there's no question at the moment, there's no question in the chat, Tara. But maybe before question comes through, I do have one question, because you sort of said the gap as it is at the moment is not very inclusive for vulnerable voices. And I think I saw in one of your slides, you mentioned there's very limited finance even for Indigenous people and local communities. So going forward with COP27, I would love to know your thoughts, your opinions, what you think might change or can be done. Well, might change is one, and then maybe we can see what can be done going forward. Thanks, Tara.
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. So I think one reason that I would say that right now it's not inclusive for vulnerable voices is because it depends on the individual activities and how those individual activities are being implemented and who's taking on those activities. And even though there are various activities that I think could work to improve, of course, ensuring that we have perspectives and national planning processes, for example, that indeed that we don't necessarily have the record that is happening, right? We have this gap when it comes to understanding, is implementation happening, because we don't have a framework really for that monitoring and that reporting. And then of course we know that there are limitations on finance and capacity. And so I don't necessarily, I know that there are some wonderful case studies that are probably existing out there that we don't know of, but I also don't want to assume that no information means the best things are happening. I think that would be rather naive as well. And so as I think about what are stronger possibilities, for example, there's an activity on climate finance and access directly to climate finance for Indigenous and grassroots solutions, which is incredibly important. But that activity is structured around raising awareness of existing technical and financial support. Well, that existing support we know hasn't been enough. That activity is not designed necessarily around direct access. And without really key deliverables on that activity, it's one of these ongoing activities, we see that we have really a missed opportunity. We need parties or relevant organizations, including multilateral climate funds, to really take on the gap. There's a huge role for advocacy that we could have here, particularly at this moment of the midterm review, of saying having a gap without implementing a gap or without providing for its implementation is going to be inadequate. So how can we get parties and relevant organizations to take on this work, to take on this implementation, to work in collaboration and partnership in creating inclusive processes? I think these are the questions of the moment. And I look forward to having greater visibility around the gap and this moment to actually say that implementation has not met the mark of where we want. And that's not necessarily just because of the COVID pandemic. We don't want to see that being used as an excuse. We want to recognize the ways in which it has absolutely impeded and reversed progress on advancing gender equality. And it's an incredibly important context in which we want to be doing this work. But I don't think that we should simply discount the ways in which we have not seen the full implementation of the gap because we have been in a more virtual and world that is financially strapped. So I hope that there are some questions.
Yeah, there are some questions. Really, thank you very much for that, your response. I don't know if the questions we see, if the person want to ask, someone from Morocco, forgive me if I didn't spell your name right, but box 320 says, what are gender dynamic pillars which identified by COP27? So what are the gender dynamic pillars that have been identified by COP27? That's the one question coming from box 320. I'll read a couple of them, so maybe you can just prepare to respond. We have Mercy Abutsa saying there are too many gaps in the United Nations and it's not working towards closing that bridge. Every year they take only the rich, don't care about people. It's not very clear, don't care people for the COP without making any room for those at the front line. So indigenous people not present to share their stories about what's really happening. So what is the United Nations doing this time differently from the last, it says 29 years, but I'll say 27 years. So that's the other question from Mercy. And last one would be, please, can we have the paper sent to our mailbox? So yes, I think we'll share the presentation for sure if you registered. But so I think we have 2 questions. And please, if you want to verbally ask your question, just raise up your hand and I'll call on you. But Tara, maybe you want to try and take those 2 questions that we've got.
Absolutely. So I would say that the gender dynamics pillars at COP27 are wide-ranging across all of the thematic areas. So I think the way that the African feminist demands have framed and situated a lot of their demands is really useful, looking at climate finance, looking at agriculture and land rights, looking at loss and damage and just transition. Sorry, I'm just trying to open that up so that I have a key reference point there. There's also the Women and Gender constituency will also be coming out with their own demands as well. And I think something that really happens every year with those is this recognition that there's not a single area within the COP where we're not talking about or should be talking about gender. Obviously, a big topic this year is loss and damage. And so we are seeing a lot of discussion about how we need to talk about loss and damage in a way that recognizes the gender considerations there. And that is one of the things that I know many people are hoping to get that recognition into the revised Gender Action Plan. The second question about participation and engagement in the actual COP process. I don't know that anything much is being done differently this year. I know that there have been reports that there are fewer civil society badges overall. I know that obviously it has been a particularly costly COP, and that's been very exclusive. And these are, I think, ongoing conversations about feminist presence, about civil society presence, about shrinking civil society space, and yet there are still some ways in which feminists and civil society are engaging, such as the Women and Gender constituency. So there are folks that will be there on site, but I think it's also important that their collective demands have emerged from processes that are long-standing and collaborative and collective, and that include voices that are not able to be there in person as well. I would also mention here, and I'm just going to put it into the chat briefly, there is actually a Gender Action Plan activity, activity B2, that is around this idea of supporting the equal participation of women, not only in party delegations, but funds to support the participation of grassroots, local, and Indigenous peoples communities. Now, this would be absolutely an example of a GAP activity that could be much more robustly implemented. I do know that the Women and Gender constituency has been able to sponsor, particularly some of those who have been engaged in the African Feminist Task Force this year. But there isn't a set of go-to fund for the participation of grassroots, local, and Indigenous peoples communities. This has been a call that has been unanswered in many ways. I would just also encourage folks to think about the different ways that there are of interacting and engaging with the UNFCCC, because this gap also highlights party level implementation. And so there is a way to do advocacy at the national and regional levels and to engage in the gap and to feel part of this UNFCCC process without actually physically being at COP. And we also want to think about ways to consider the UNFCCC process not just being something that happens 2 times a year at the intersessional negotiations and at the COP, but as something that should be constantly informing and supporting gender responsive climate implementation.
Thanks. I really love that last one you just said, saying, it's not something that happens as static positions. It's something we should try and do constantly. Does anyone want to just ask their question verbally? Maybe it's good to hear another voice. Please just raise up your hands or mute yourself and ask, because there are more questions, but I thought maybe if someone would like to ask the question verbally. Okay, or if not, there's Uzoma. You want to also, Uzoma wrote to me directly, so that's not for everyone. There's Ne Umoren. You want to ask your question directly? Just unmute and go ahead, please. Ne Umoren. If not, I would ask a question. How effective is all the gender frameworks on climate change is it being to translate to grassroots women in aspect of their voices being heard by COP27? Well, Tara, if you want to answer, but maybe I could say some few things in response to this question, and then Tara, you can add on. Women Engage for a Common Future, which is the organization I work with. We try to, because we realize that funds is quite a huge thing, and also preparing to come for these conferences also not only just expensive, but also complicated, as Tara also tried to share. So we try to act as a bridge, bring in voices from the programs that we're doing to come share their stories physically, but also maybe via videos or via written publications, so that we can just sort of bring their own voices to these spaces. Because yes, all of us can't go to COP, for instance, but like Tara said, we need to find a way to perhaps bring the UNFCCC to these areas so that stories of what's going on at the grassroots are being heard. But funds, I agree, are very much key. And one of the organizations and constituencies helping to make that happen is this movement building, which the Women and Gender constituency is doing. So it could be one way that we're saying, let's join forces here. The more powerful, the more visible will be heard. And I see a hand coming from Dr. Priscilla. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Tara, for that wonderful presentation. Very detailed indeed, within a short space of time. I just want to share, Christy, you asked some questions. What is happening on the ground? And of course, you have tried to answer some of those questions by yourself. Women Environmental Program is working with a couple of other organizations across Africa. Tara shared one of the slides, which I featured prominently. I feel so happy. As African women and girls, African feminists, since January this year, we've been mobilizing across all the continent to make sure that we present a common voice during COP27. And of course, we have our demands. Our demands ranges from the issues of climate finance, the issues of adaptation, the issues of loss and damage, the issues of agriculture, because we feel that these are critical issues that are affecting Africa and as women and girls of the African continent. So for us to go there, we also have a charter of demand. And just last month, we launched, this month, we launched our charter of demand publicly for people to know and the negotiators to know that this is what the African women and girls are taking to COP27. And from that, we are going to be engaging with them. But just as you have said, we are also doing a kind of documentary. And this documentary of what has happened this year, it happens to be like the worst year in the history of Nigeria when it comes to disasters, climate-induced disasters, flooding everywhere, and a lot of people have lost their lives, lost their source of livelihoods. In fact, most of them are not displaced. So as I speak with you now, we're working with our partners, which is the Christian Aid, that we're doing some kind of documentary on the ground so that we now take this documentary to really showcase at COP27 that we are not just talking, it's not just about theory, but it's also about practicals. This is what is happening on the ground. And apart from that, we are working with wonderful organizations such as yours, Women Engaged for a Common Future. We are partnering with WIDO, we are partnering with Feminine, and of course, a lot of synergies from the civil society and the women organization across Africa have come with a strong voice. Right now, the feminist forum just finished from Namibia. And of course, looking at the demands that we already have, we have also articulated in Namibia, what do we really want? We need to go as a continent. We are not going as diverse issues, diverse voices. Even with our negotiators, when we had our meeting in Ghana, we had a number of negotiators that are coming in there. And so for us, we are going as a common front, from the voice, from the grassroots to the regional level to the continental level. Let our negotiators hear our voices, that this is what we want when it comes to the issues of climate change. Enough of the talk. We are talking about systems change. We are not talking about climate change. Let the system change so that it will be favorable for the vulnerable groups, especially the people with disabilities, the people, the young, the old, who don't have a place, who don't have a voice, who will speak for them. And so for us as an organization, I'm partnering with several other organizations across Africa and across the globe with the Women and Gender Consistency. We are going with a very strong voice. And this strong voice, I just want to tell you that as WEP, with the support of CA, Christian Aid, with the support of WIDO, with the support of Women Engaged for a Common Future, and with the support of the Canadians, WEP is going with almost 22 participants. And most of these are from the grassroots that we're taking, including also the negotiators. We are taking them to COP. So I just want to say thank you very much, because for us, this is critical. The people that we're taking will speak for themselves. We are no longer going to be speaking for them, but then we now say, this is how it is affecting us, and this is what is happening, and this is what we want, and not we speaking for them. And so we are going to have a couple of side events. We are going to have the side event that will talk about the vulnerabilities from the grassroots to the national, to the regional, to the global level. But also we are going to present our demands at that. And apart from that, we are going to join a lot of the other organizations in organizing several events, which including the training of the negotiators, which WEP has been invited to be part of it and to help facilitate. That is through me. So I can tell you that this time around, I am so happy that for the first time, African feminists, African women and girls, including the negotiators, are united, because this is a fight for us. We need to fight for our right. We need to fight for our future. We need to fight for our land. We need to fight for what rightly belongs to us. So I just wanted to share that perspective of what WEP is taking to COP27. And even beyond that, we are going to be still mobilizing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priscilla. And I know there's even a post-COP event already. Looking forward to that. Maybe you will share that with the participants later on. I see there's a hand from Christian Manam. Please go ahead and maybe ask your question or share your comments.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to appreciate the last speaker for giving more light to the question, because we in Africa has faced a lot when it comes to climate change. We have faced a lot. Just what happened to my state in Benue, when I see a lot of dead bodies and the rest. Even the killings that Fulanis are killing us is the same thing of climate change. But we have been going for COP20, we have been going for COP years in, years out, and this thing keep getting worse day by day. So to the extent I look at it that COP has become an annual event where people go to make merry, to celebrate, and then we come back and nothing happens and we continue. So I was so curious that, are we going to continue like this? That's why I asked that question, and I pray that if I would be opportune to attend COP, I will still ask the same question, because this has become a usual business. But with the clarification that the last speaker just gave, it gives me more joy, and it makes me now understand that yes, we really have people who are going to fight for us. Because if really our issues have been taken to COP, things would have changed. But I guess our issues doesn't take, or maybe our issues go there, but after the COP, it becomes an end of the whole story. So thank you so much for that. That is just what I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for joining and sharing that passionate plea and request. What can we do? And I think we have to help ourselves to figure out how we're going to change things and then come with a proposal. But I agree that it shouldn't be a space, COP27 or the next COP shouldn't only be spaces where a lot of talk is done, like Dr. Priscilla said. It's a place where action should flow from. But thank you for that powerful sharing. And there's Bridget. Please go ahead on Web Togo. See your hand up.
Hello.
Hi, Bridget.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bridget from Web Togo, Women Environmental Program in Togo, and thank you for this event, which is very important for us as women organization, as we are preparing to go at the COP27. Right. What I want to say, Dr. Priscilla has said a lot of my idea, and I want to join my voice to the voice of others colleagues to say that we are going to this COP, the COP27, which will not be the same with the other COP. We want action, please. We are dying. We women in the grassroots, we are dying. We are facing dry pocket. We are facing effects of climate change. I don't know how to tell it, please. I'm in emotion. Serious problem and situation are doing in the grassroots with women. Women are responsible to give food for family, to give food for children. And every year we are talking COP. What thing is happening? We want to join our voice like women to tell our vulnerability. We are vulnerable. We are living the negative effects of climate change in our village, in our rural community. And we want to loud our voice to tell the reality of what we are living with women who are dying because of climate change. In agriculture area, in agriculture situation, so and so. Please, I talk more French, but I try to speak what I want to say in English. We have to act our gender action plan, gender climate plan. We want to be action, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for that very, very loud and clear statement saying we heard your voice, and I hope others will hear. But thank you. And I really thank you also for speaking in English, because my French is very limited as well. So David will take your points, and I think that might bring us to the last 5 minutes of this session, which has been very great. So David, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Web. Thank you, Tara, for this wonderful session, and then Christy for facilitating it. It has actually been a very fruitful and informative session. However, the feedback I have for everybody participating in this particular session is we all know how important its evidence is to inform whatsoever conversation that we want to have at the COP27. It's very important that these issues that we are highlighting in this meeting are properly well documented, since WEP will be leading, a lot of will be leading on taking so many persons to participate in this particular event. It will be very important that a platform, I believe there is one, will be shared with virtually everybody who is here, and shared externally as well, to actually document these issues, to collect these issues and document them. These will also inform the programming, the kind of programs or the presentations that we'll be having at the COP27, because it won't be nice. There are a lot happening, but we can't speak, in beats. It has to be informed by, let's collate these issues and have them as evidence, so that even when those stakeholders who will be interested in taking actions on some of these issues, demand for, what we call more like an evidence, or the documentation of where, what they can inform their line of action, we'll be able to have something to present to them. To be nice to get pictorial. For me, in terms of storytelling, I believe that pictures tell a lot of stories, and let's not just have words, in write-ups and all of that. To be nice to back them up with pictures, if we have video evidences of some of the challenges. The recent flooding in Nigeria, for example, these are some of the issues. And if you look at the major casualties, they're actually women and children and girls. A lot of them can't even go to school right now. Some cannot access their farm and all of that. So these are issues that pictures and videos will tell the stories more than actually just having them on paper and in words. So it will be nice for us to collate these issues and have them as a document, maybe in video forms or pictorial forms, so that we have a solid document that can actually express what those issues are in Nigeria and across Africa. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that. Indeed, they say a picture tells 1,000 words. So yeah, well noted. And I really thank everyone. There's been a lot of chats going on and maybe more questions, but I saw one asking, how do we implement the Gender Action Plan? And to that question, I'll say, I think WEP has documentation, and I think even some photos as well, where they did share that story. I think it took 4 years to get the plan implemented or adopted, at least by Nigerian government. So I would say contact Dr. Priscilla and her team, and Anne and Marie. They will have answers to that question. Tara, I would like to give you the last 2 minutes of this session. If you want to please say some concluding words on this wonderful topic we've had about the UNFCCC in connection with the Gender Action Plan. Thank you.
Thank you. It's incredibly difficult for me to follow up all of that amazing and impassioned call for the type of systemic change that we absolutely need to see, and that we know cannot happen without meaningful, inclusive participation and ensuring that the voices from the front lines are heard. I think what I would like to end on is this idea that the Gender Action Plan and the UNFCCC aren't the answer. They are part of a bureaucratic process that it helps us to learn how to navigate, to help achieve ultimately the transformation we want to see, but that they are not going to be the source of that transformation. That there's a space and an opportunity at COP to help shift the normative frameworks, to help the world see with more moral clarity the importance of these issues that you're raising, the importance of of transformation, but that ultimately, like, the source of that transformation, we know it starts at, and its heart is at the grassroots. So I just want to keep that in mind, that we think about these things such as the UNFCCC and the GAP as tools, but not as the only spaces for change, because I know that the things that you are doing and the actions that you are leading are what's ultimately going to be the source of transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for reminding us that it's we people, human beings, who have to indeed implement actions. And yeah, it will take all of us working together, I think, to bring about those actions. I want to thank you very much, Tara Daniels, for joining us today very early, for you in the United States. And I want to thank WEP very much for organizing this event, allowing all of us to come here to listen, to engage, and to share our voices in this space, which I hope will resonate across the world from wherever we are. Thank you. Thank you. I have to call the session to a stop. It was meant to be for 1 hour, but I appreciate that most of you have stayed on for past an hour. I want to wish you all the best for the rest of the day. And yeah, looking forward to COP27 and beyond, where we'll have climate change to be something that we don't have to face in fear, but we have the tools, the means, and I think the collective voices to bring about a different transformation. That's what Tara says. Thank you once again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
That has been able to make out time to join. We will share the recordings with everybody that has registered or has joined, so that you, and also the presentation, so that you have what has been presented today, even those that have missed us. So thank you very much. Thank you to our partners, CA, Widows, WCF, and our Canada friends who are not here, Catherine Hughes. Thank you all for making this possible, but also for the support that we will be at COP27 come November 5th, 2022. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.